This video is on bonds. So what exactly is a bond? A bond is a loan, but instead of the typical loan that you think of, a bond is actually when you lend money to a company or to a government. And this can be a local, state, or federal government. So you lend money to either this company or government for a certain length of time. And in exchange, that company or the government promises to pay you back your money plus pay you some interest. There is a lot of vocabulary that goes with bonds, so let's go over a few of those different words. One, you have issuer. Issuer is just the person that is the company or government that is selling the bond, the company or government that is trying to collect this money. The principal is how much you pay for the bond. And when you buy the bond, there's going to be a certain interest rate that goes with that bond. This is the interest rate that they will pay you per year on your bond. Another word for interest rate when we're talking about bonds is coupon rate. Coupon rate and interest rate, same thing, different names. The interest is the actual money that you get paid that is not your principal. This is that interest that they're paying you in order to borrow money from you. And the amount of that interest is equal to how much you paid for the bond times the interest rate. Another word for interest is coupon. Coupon dates are the dates the issuer is supposed to pay you the interest payments or the coupons. Uh, Typically, there are 1 to 2 coupon dates per year, right? The term is how long the bond is from start to end. So if you buy the bond today, in 5 years, they're supposed to pay you back the money they borrowed, then the term is 5 years. The maturity date is the day the company or government is supposed to give you back the money they borrowed. The face value is the amount you get back at the end of the bond. Default. Default is a verb. This is when the company or government is unable or does not pay you when they're supposed to. So if there's a coupon date for January 1st, and on January 1st, the company or government does not pay you, and then January 2nd comes along, they have defaulted on that bond. Bonds are put into different grades. The grade of the bond is telling you the quality of the bond. And when we say quality here, we're talking about how likely the issuer is to pay you back, how likely the issuer is to pay you that interest. The lowest grade bond is called junk bonds. Investment grade bonds are anything that is above junk. Some bonds are classified as high yield bonds. High yield bonds have a high interest rate, but that high interest rate is because that bond has a higher chance to default, or there's a higher chance the person borrowing the money, the government or company borrowing the money, will not pay you when they're supposed to. Junk bonds are high yield. Okay, So how does the whole bond process work? These steps here are before you get involved as a buyer of bonds. So a government or company will want to spend money on something, but won't have the money. That's how this process starts. If it's the government, maybe the government wants to put in a new train station. The government wants to improve the, the canal. The government wants to do some sort of project, usually. And the government will then, even though it does not have the money, it figures doing this project will either bring in enough revenue to cover that project or will have a higher benefit than the cost of the interest payments they'll have to pay. So the government wants to do something they feel is beneficial, but they don't have this money, so they want to get this money. The company might have some sort of project as well. For example, a company might want to invest in some research, but they don't have the money to fund that, so they might issue bonds. There are lots of different reasons. This is just one of the reasons why a company or government might want to issue bonds. So now they have the desire to issue bonds. So that company or government goes to an investment company and tells them how much they want to raise. The investment company looks at the quality of that government or company. That investment company looks at the probability that that company or government will pay people back the money it is borrowing, and they will set an interest rate for that bond. So here are some examples of investment companies that might do that middle step of issuing the bonds on behalf of the government or a company. These are just some examples. There are many, many investment companies that do this. So now the investment company will put those bonds on their website and start selling them. And here's where you come in. Step one, you have some money that you want to invest in a bond. You go to that investment company's website and you pay X amount of dollars for a bond. That X amount of dollars is the principal. And when you buy this bond, there is a certain length of the loan, or there's a certain term for that bond. And when you're buying that bond, there will be a interest rate that is listed with the bond. And usually this is a fixed rate that will be good for the whole length of the bond. So you have now bought this bond. What happens next? Well, the issuer will pay you interest every blank number of months. For the most common for bonds is that they will pay you either once a year or they'll pay you twice a year. And so every year during the term of the bond, the issuer pays you and pays you and pays you the interest. And at the very end, at the end of the loan or at the maturity date, the issuer pays you back that the amount that you loaned them, the principal you loaned them. Or in this, the most technical term right here is the face value of the bond. Let's do a quick example. let's say that you buy a 4% 10-year bond from Sarah's Sandpaper Corporation for $100. Okay? And let's say that this bond pays annually, which means once a year. So because this is an annual, the coupons are paid annually. Because coupons are paid once a year. Sarah's Sandpaper Company once a year is going to pay you that 4% of your principal. 4% times $100 is $4. At the end of your bond, at the maturity date, that company is then supposed to give you back the $100 that you loaned them. This is the most simple example. This is an example of you buying a new bond. It gets a little bit more complicated if you buy a used bond from somebody who had originally bought it. In this particular example, the money that you get back is equal to the money that you originally put in. It's a little bit different for when you buy a used bond from somebody else, which is why we have these two different words: face value for how much you're supposed to get back at the end of the bond, and principal, how much you pay for the bond. But let's continue. That's getting into a bit of a more complicated example. So there are many different types of bonds. I mentioned before that a bond is either you lending money to a company or to the government. If you lend money to a company, that is called a corporate bond. If you lend money to a city or a state government, that is called a municipal bond. And if you lend money to the US government, to the federal government, that is called a treasury bond. And technically treasury bonds has a more specific definition. But these things, treasury bills, treasury notes, treasury bonds, for right now you can think of it all as you lending money to the US federal government. The difference between those three different types is how long that loan lasts. So for treasury bills, if it's less than a year, it's called a treasury bill. If you're loaning the government for 1, 3, 5, 7, or 10 years, it's called a treasury note. And then treasury bonds, technically, is for a 30-year duration. So any of these others are not technically treasury bonds, although I'm going to personally just refer to all of these as bonds for this video. These are the most common length of time bonds are originally issued for. So 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 3 years, 5, 10, 15, and 30 years. This is for new bonds. Because you can buy used bonds, you can buy a bond of basically any duration. If someone buys a bond, a 5-year bond, and then sells it the very next day, you can buy a bond with the duration of 4 years and 364 days. All right, this is the interest rates for bonds for a specific company that I looked up. So this is, I looked at an investment company called Vanguard, And I looked at their interest rates for December 9th, 2020, and this is what it is. So let's take a moment to look at these different rates. A couple things that you might notice. I would actually say right now, pause the video and take a moment to look through and see what sort of patterns you see. And when you're ready, hit play. Some patterns that many people will notice is that the longer the duration, the higher the interest rate. So the 10 years, CDs and treasuries, they pay a higher interest rate than, say, the 2-year one. Same thing with our bonds for municipal, bonds for the corporate. There are a couple things that here that does not follow that pattern. But in general, for normal markets, the longer the duration, the higher the interest rate. And that's because for the longer the duration, the more risk is associated with that bond that the issuer will not pay you back. Here where it says, let's look at municipal for a second, and you will see these letters afterwards, AAA, AA, A, triple B. So those right there in parentheses are the ratings. AAA is their highest rating that Vanguard uses. And so any state or city government that has a AAA rating, they are the ones that Vanguard believes are most likely to repay their bondholders. That might be because these cities or governments have low debt or have very good income stream coming in compared to their amount of money that they're spending. Same sort of thing you'll see in corporate. AAA, AA, A, and triple B. If you'll notice, there is a big jump in interest rates when you go from A to triple B. I believe the triple B is Vanguard's junk bond rating. Okay, interest rates depend on two basic things, which we've sort of talked about already. One, the credit quality of the issuer, and here the word quality is just talking about how likely the investment company that is selling the bond thinks the issuer will pay you back. The more likely the issuer is to pay you back, the higher quality we say that bond is. And therefore they get a better rating. And when you get a better rating, that company or government has to pay less money, less interest to borrow money. Two, duration of the bond. Longer durations are considered more risky, and so therefore longer durations have to pay a higher interest rate to borrow money. All right. And there's this just general truth. This is not just for bonds, but for all investments, for loans as well. The higher the risk, the higher the return, or the higher the return, the higher the risk. So when you're looking at these interest rates, it's also a way to judge how risky something is. Now let's look at, and thinking about it that way, I want you to pause the video and think about the different risks of these different types of issuers. When you're ready, hit play again. So if you notice a couple things, so let's compare CDs to treasuries. Across the board, for this whole thing, regardless of duration, well, I guess not regardless of the duration, for most of the durations here, you'll notice that the CD actually currently has a lower interest rate than the treasury bonds. That is only not true here for the 3 years, 4 years, and 5 years. One possible explanation for this might be that in order for the CD to actually default, first the company would have to default, would have to go out of business. And then we mentioned in the previous video that CDs are FDIC insured by the US federal government. So for you to not get the money back from a CD, both the company and the US federal government would both have to default on their obligation to you. Treasury bonds don't technically have something called an FDIC insurance, but the Treasury bond is also backed by the US federal government. So the only way for them to not have the money to pay you is if the government went bankrupt. So CDs, two things, the bank and the government would have to default. For Treasury bonds, only the government would have to default. So that might mean that they're a little bit more risky. So for most of these durations, you'll notice the Treasury bonds have a slightly higher interest rate, which means at least investors are thinking that they are slightly more risky. But let's compare Treasury bonds to municipal bonds or to corporate bonds. If you notice in general, corporate and municipal bonds have a higher interest rate than the Treasury bonds, which means that they are even considered more risky. All right, so in addition to this general truth, let's talk about something else I mentioned earlier in the video, that bonds can be bought and sold. You have your initial selling of the bond, but after you buy that bond, you are allowed to resell that bond anytime you want. In the example earlier in the video, you can literally buy a bond, and then the very next day, you can sell that bond if you want. A used bond is sold on something called the secondary market. Secondary just because it's used. So the price you pay or the price you get for selling that used bond may be different than the price you actually paid. You paid $10,000 for a bond. When you resell it used, you might not get $10,000, but you actually might get more than $10,000. One big thing that affects how much you will get for that bond you are reselling is the interest rates that similar bonds, similar new bonds are paying. So if you are trying to sell a bond that has a 4-year duration still left on it, maybe I should use a different example. Let's say you're trying to sell a bond, a used bond that still has 3 years left on it. Well, you have to look at what is the interest rate for other 3-year bonds from similar issuers. If the new bonds that are issued by a similar issuer is paying a higher interest rate than the one you have on your bond, well, any buyers are going to want to buy that bond instead of yours. So the only way to get them to buy your bond instead is to lower the price you're asking for that bond. And you keep on having to lower your price until basically the math works out that someone buying the bond can make an equal amount of money from your bond that you're selling on the secondary market and a new bond for like a similar duration. Okay. There is this word in investment called liquidity. Liquidity is an adjective and basically describes how easy or difficult it is to sell something and turn it into cash. In this case, since we're talking about bonds, we're talking about selling a bond and turning it into cash. Longer term bonds tend to be less liquid. This is a general statement and might not always be true for every case. Federal bonds, US federal bonds, tend to be more liquid than corporate bonds. And in fact, the US Treasury bonds are the most liquid bonds of any bonds in the whole world. US Treasury bonds are super easy to sell, super easy to buy, and a large quantity of them get bought and sold every single day. Let's move on to another thing I talked about earlier in the video, defaulting. So, once again, defaulting is when the issuer, either the government you loan money to or the company you loan money to, is supposed to pay you at a certain point, maybe pay you interest or maybe pay you your principal back, and they don't do that on the date that they're supposed to. When that happens, that company or government has defaulted on that bond. And once that happens, a bunch of different people who are owed money are going to attempt to get that company or government to pay them before paying other people. If a company or government is defaulting, that means they do not have enough money usually to pay everybody. So then there is a mad scramble by everyone who's owed money to try to get that company or government to pay them as much as they can get. What will usually happen is that everybody will end up losing at least some money. And when I say lose money, I mean compared to how much they were supposed to get. Maybe in the end, they still made money, but less money than they thought they were going to get when they first bought the bond. Okay. To talk about who gets paid first, let's talk about a couple of different categories of people. And right here, I'm going to talk more about corporate bonds than government bonds. But bondholders are considered lenders, and bondholders are paid before this class of people called investors. When we're talking about corporate bonds or we're talking about companies, investors are the people who own stock in the company. So bondholders will be paid before stockholders are ever paid anything. Another class, though, of people who might be owed money are called secured creditors. And bondholders are actually paid after the secured creditors. Secured creditors is anybody who that company owes money to, and when that company, when the secured creditor gave that company money or equipment or whatever, that company backed that loan with collateral. Basically, that company said, look, secure creditors, please lend us this equipment or lend us this money. If we can't pay you back, then hey, you can have this object here from us. That collateral might be such things as equipment or real estate or vehicles. So the secured creditors will get paid first, then bondholders, and the very last people who will get paid are people who own stock in the company. So that's the general sort of way bonds work. There are a couple of extra benefits that some types of bonds have. For US Treasury bonds, bills, and notes, you don't have to pay federal taxes on that interest. So if you lend the federal government money, they don't make you pay taxes on that interest that they themselves give you. For municipal bonds, so these are when you lend state or local governments money, you don't have to pay federal taxes on the interest, and sometimes you don't have to pay state taxes on that interest. In order to not pay state taxes on the interest, you almost always have to buy a bond from the state that you actually live in. This is usually true. This not paying state taxes on the interest is usually true if you buy it from your own state, but it is not always true. The US is made out of 50 different states, and each state have their own rules on that state's taxes. For both of these, though, because this extra benefit is paying less taxes, people who are in a higher tax bracket benefit more from this benefit. And by higher tax bracket, we can just say rich people. So rich people tend to benefit more from these federal taxes and state taxes that they may not have to pay.